We're gonna get started. Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. On behalf of the Junior Economic Club of New York City, I would like to say a special welcome to the members of the other JEC branches that are here today. For everyone, please make sure to mute your mics and turn on your camera if you have handed in your photo release form. If you have any questions, raise your hand on Zoom or type it in the chat. Or you can type it straight to me if you'd like me to say your question out loud if you're not comfortable. We are so honored to have Professor Daniel Altman here today to speak about economic journalism. Dan Altman was an economics columnist for The Economist and The New York Times before becoming an economic advisor in the British government. He wrote several books on economics and economic policy, including the international bestseller Outrageous Fortunes. Later, he worked as a director at Dalberg, a consulting firm focused on international development. At that time, he was also a frequent commentator on CNN and the BBC, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. After a stint as senior editor for economics at Foreign Policy and adjunct faculty at New York University's Stern School of Business, he branched out into sports analytics by founding Northyard Analytics and eventually creating SmarterScout.com, the first publicly available advanced analytics platform for global soccer. He is now a part-time owner of Rochdale AFC, an English soccer club, and a member of USA Weightlifting's performance service team. Let's give a warm welcome to Professor Altman.
All right, well, thanks very much. Today, I thought I would talk a little bit about how we think about economics, and then we'll turn to how we write about economics. I am going to speak for a little while, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, because I think that's probably the most productive way for us to use this time together. I'm going to ask you to send your questions to Eileen via chat. I think that's the best way to do it. So she has them in the order that they come in, and she can read them to me, tell me who asked the question. That's going to be much easier for me than just trying to figure out who's talking on this enormous screen of faces. It's a little bit more difficult than it would be in a lecture hall, since I can't even see all of them at the same time. There are two screens worth of people. So just send your questions to Eileen, and when we're ready, she'll be able to read them to me. So the first part of what I want to present today is just a few comments about how we think about economics. Economics is most fundamentally a way of seeing the world. If you study economics for as long as I did, you will get a toolbox for interpreting the world around you. Now, economics is not the only field where you can get a toolbox like that. If you study sociology or political science, you'll get a slightly different toolbox. If you study chemistry or biology, you'll get a slightly different toolbox. But economics gives you a toolbox and a way of seeing the world. And fundamentally, economics is about how people react to incentives. It's about how people make decisions based on the incentives that they face around them, the stimuli that they encounter, and the resources that they have access to. So when we talk about economics as a science, it's really about trying to understand how and why people make certain decisions in their households, in their work life, in their business, and when they get together in groups like governments as well. Now, just that definition might not seem that specific to you, because you could be a biologist and think about how people make decisions, how they react to stimuli, right? But economics has a very particular way of doing it. For many years, economics was based on mathematical models. And the idea of these models was to try and figure out if there was a way to simplify and codify the way people made decisions. We would say, for example, that we thought people would try to make themselves as happy as possible, subject to the amount of wealth and resources that they had access to. You may have heard this term constrained optimization. So they face some constraints and they try and optimize their own satisfaction, their own happiness within those constraints. And mathematicians and economists came up with models that seemed to describe these things in a pretty good way, ways that we could describe preferences mathematically, and ways that we could predict decision-making mathematically. But the great assumption that was behind all of this was not that people used those mathematical models when they were trying to make decisions, but that they acted as though they did. And the classic example is one that Milton Friedman, and Nobel laureate in economics, once wrote about, which is to say, if we watch a really good billiards or pool player, shooting balls with a cue, that game is governed by the laws of physics, but the billiard player is not calculating all the angles and the impulses in his or her head. That's not how they play. They have a feel for it, and they act as though, because of all their experience, all their learning, all their talent, they play as though they were solving those models. So economics was trying to come up with the same sorts of models so we could try and describe a person as though they were following those models and making their decisions. And as I said, that was true until about, I would say, 30, 40 years ago, when economists started to understand that these mathematical models alone, or at least the ones that they were using at the time, were not sufficient to describe people's actions, because sometimes people did things that were not described by the models. Sometimes people did things that were kind of surprising. And you may be one of those people. For example, if you set your alarm to wake up at 6 a.m. every night, you set it for 6 a.m. And then when the alarm goes off at 6 a.m., you hit the snooze button. Why did you set it for 6 a.m.? You've interrupted your sleep. You could have set it for 6:10 and had uninterrupted sleep, which would have made you better off. But instead, you slept till 6, your alarm went off, and you had 10 minutes of choppy sleep after you hit the snooze button. Why did you do that? There was no economic model at that time that could describe why you would do that. Why something that your last night's self thought was a good idea, your this morning self thought was a bad idea. Okay? You had two selves that were disagreeing with each other. We call this dynamic inconsistency. So economics had to somehow become more psychological. And this is how the field of behavioral economics was born. And it's almost redundant now to say behavioral economics, because I think all economics has started to incorporate behavioral aspects, and so has finance. So now we have a sort of richer understanding of people, not just how they make decisions, but the mentality behind it. And so that's been the big progression, I would say, in economics in the last 30, 40 years. But still, fundamentally, economics is about how and why people make decisions, and trying to come up with a framework that can describe those things. Because a framework like that is really useful, right? If you are selling a product, or trying to make government policy, or even planning your own household budget, it's very useful to know how you would make decisions, how well off certain things might make you feel, and how you would choose to buy things, save money, invest in different things based on what they might do in the future and what you might want in the future. So we still have a very useful science, and I think it's even more useful now that it's acquired this extra richness. Economics can't just be math, though. We talk about trying to model more and more things to make our mathematical models richer and more descriptive. But there has to be something behind it. There has to be some intuition behind it. When I was in graduate school for economics at Harvard, we had some people who had come straight from math degrees and decided that they wanted to study economics. And they were fantastic mathematicians. And the first couple of years of grad school are very mathematically intensive. And that stuff was a lot easier for them than it was for people who just studied mostly economics like I had. But they were missing that intuition. They were missing that feel for how people make decisions and how people react, and the types of things that they had to watch out for when they tried to predict what people do. So you really have to have both. Just like I had to learn more math, they had to learn more of that economic intuition. And I would say that even though I had 8 years of training in economics, coming out of graduate school and going into the real world, I sort of had to learn it all over again. And this was really, I would say, the fourth time I'd learned economics. you could start with an Introduction to Economics or Principles to Economics textbook, and you'd learn the basics of supply and demand, choice over time, choice under uncertainty, things like that, and a little bit of macroeconomics too. That's great. That is 90% of economics in that first year textbook. You have touched on 90% of the important topics in economics. But then in your next year, you learn them again with a little more math. This time you use calculus to solve those constrained optimization problems. Great. So now you've covered the same topics again, but you did it with more math so that you could be a little more complex in your thinking. Then you go to grad school. You do it again. You take microeconomics and macroeconomics all over again in the first year of grad school. This time the math gets even more complicated. And you have to be able to prove certain things, not just go through menus of formulas. So now you've learned the same thing 3 times at increasing levels of mathematical complexity. You write a master's thesis, you write a PhD thesis, you get really good at some specific area of economics, and you go out into the real world. And you have to learn it all over again. Because the way things work in the real world is not always what you find in the textbook. You know, one of the things that you're probably familiar with if you've studied some economics is this idea that trade always makes people better off, right? We have a theory about trade that 2 economies, whatever it is that they make, will always be better off when they trade. Even if one economy is better at making everything than the other economy, you still have this theory of comparative advantage, which allows you to find the things that one economy makes relatively more efficiently, let them do that. The other economy makes the things that they make relatively more efficiently, even though in absolute terms, one economy may be much less efficient than the other. When you do that, you take advantage of the relative efficiencies, and all of a sudden, the gains to the winners in that trade outweigh the losses to the losers. So whoever lost their job because you're not producing some product in their economy anymore, they're still going to be potentially better off because the other people in the economy are doing so much better. However, to make sure everybody is at least as well off, you have to redistribute, right? You have to say, okay, well, we're going to take some of the gains to the winners and compensate the losers, because we know that there are winners and losers in trade, right? We see it in every country. You know, when jobs get offshored or outsourced, then people lose their jobs, factories close. So if you want to make sure that everybody really is at least as well off as the formula and the axioms in economics suggest, you have to redistribute. In real life, we don't do that. We barely do it at all. There are some things called trade adjustment assistance programs in the United States, and other countries have little bits that try to help retrain people who lose their jobs because of globalization, stuff like that. But it's almost at the level of lip service. You know, have you ever thought that you should pay a tax on the cheap TV that you buy from China or Korea so that you can compensate the people who lost their jobs in the TV manufacturing company in Arizona? No, we don't have programs like that. But that's what we would have to do to fulfill what the textbook described to us. So there are a lot of things in the real world that don't work quite the way the textbook would describe. And there are people you will meet who have never taken economics in undergrad or grad school who understand the economy really well, who would say something like, wow, oil prices have gone down quite a lot. That means that there's going to be increased political instability in Iran. They just know that that's true. Well, why is it true? Iran relies on petroleum exports. When prices go down, their export revenue takes a big hit. However, they've already budgeted for a higher level of revenue for this year. So they're going to be spending more in their federal budget than they thought, relatively more than what they're going to take in, right? They're going to run a bigger budget deficit than they expected. Well, what are they going to do? Well, they could try and juice the economy with monetary policy, print a lot of money. That's going to drive inflation up. So you might have this situation where you're running big budget deficits and you got rampant inflation, and all of a sudden people's living standards are going to start falling. And that leads to political instability. So how many steps was that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps that your economics student would have had to go through to get from oil prices falling to political instability in Iran. But somebody who's just been in the markets, who's experienced this in a real world setting, knows that right away. They do that in 1 step. So you have to learn for the 4th time how to interpret some of these changes. And that's really where you get to the level where you can start thinking about economics very intuitively, but also having all the math and modeling to back it up. And I think that's the best place to be when you want to start writing about economics. Writing about economics is really challenging, I would say. I'm not just trying to pat myself on the back, but I'd say it's really challenging because you have to take some of these ideas, which can be quite complex, and describe them in a way that's intelligible to almost any reader, right? You know, there's an old saying, which is, if you can't explain your ideas to a 6-year-old, then you don't really understand them that well yourself. And you should always keep that in mind when you're writing about economics. You should not be writing something that is so convoluted that your teacher can't understand it. In fact, it shouldn't be too convoluted for your 8-year-old brother to understand either. Okay? It has to be pretty easy and logical to explain. Logic is really one of the building blocks of economics, as it is with math. So you have to take these ideas and make them comprehensible. The good news is that the most powerful ideas in economics are the simplest, like supply and demand. And you're going to keep coming back to those ideas again and again. But when something gets a little more complicated, you have to really kind of draw it out in a way that is intelligible. I'll give you an example. When I was at the New York Times back in 2002, we were doing a lot of stories on Enron. And I wrote a story that ended up on the front page, which showed that Enron had hidden about $4 billion in debt, which was close to 1/3 of its debt, by listing it on their financial statements as hedging transactions, that they were trying to hedge risks in the market for things like oil prices or whatever it was. But actually, these transactions had been with banks, and they were essentially loans. And in fact, the banks even reported them as loans on their balance sheets. So the banks reported these transactions as loans. Enron called it hedging activity, so it didn't contribute to their debt in their financial statements. You may have heard the Enron story. It was a huge energy company that totally collapsed in a big scandal in 2001 and 2002. So we were trying to sort through all of the wreckage, and this was one of the things that we found. So I sat down with Glenn Cramon, who at that time was the business editor at the Times, and he said, well, how are we going to write the story? And I started telling him the things that I thought were important about it. And he said, here's what you got to do. You have to write this story 3 times. And it's a bit like the way I was describing to you how you learn economics. He said, in your lead, at the very top, you write it in the simplest possible way. Enron hid $4 billion of loans as derivatives trades, okay? Or maybe don't even use the word derivatives, okay? Make it even simpler than that. Then he said, in the second time, after you've described the basics, then you take a step back and write it again. So this is the second part of the same story. You're going to describe in a little more detail what happened, and this time you could use the word derivatives. And then the third time, after you do that, then you're going to get into the nitty-gritty of who were the bank syndicates that floated these loans, and what was the format, and what were the contracts like, and all of that. So again, we had to do it in 3 chunks as building blocks for the reader. So the reader would get the gist of it, then they'd get a little more detail, and then if they wanted to, they could keep reading and really understand all of the nitty-gritty. I thought that was really instructive. Now, in general, writing about economics for a sort of public audience, a general audience, is just like writing about anything else. You want to make a good build-up of facts if you're just writing something factual, or if you're trying to write an opinion, you want an essay that has a real point to it, where you're engaging the reader and adding things to your argument so that the reader can only come to one possible conclusion at the end of it, right? That's the way you would write any type of essay. It's no different with economics. But the thing with economics is you have to be careful how you're going to sprinkle the math and the data in along with the points that you're making. And so, you want to make it accessible to the reader as much as possible. These days, the way we write has changed a little bit because people don't necessarily, sit down and strap in for a 3,000-word essay. I hate writing 3,000-word essays anyway, but even a 900-word essay. And so you have to front load things even more because people's attention spans are a little bit shorter and they're just jumping all over the internet reading different things. So you want to pack a lot of punch in your first couple of paragraphs, and you have to be even more engaging to get them to keep reading. That's a challenge for everybody again. It's not just writing about economics. But the one thing I will say about writing about economics is it's very difficult to satisfy all the possible audiences because you have a sort of general audience who wants to find out what's going on. But economics is a science, and you may have some professional economists who read what you write as well. And you have to satisfy them too. Otherwise, they're going to write in and say, well, this wasn't quite right. There were some technical things here that were wrong. So, it's very difficult to write something that's going to make people happy if they're looking for something written by a journalist, but also happy if they're looking for something written by someone who has an academic background in economics. To be able to serve those two audiences at once, the general audience and the expert audience, is extremely difficult. People in a lot of other fields don't have to do that, right? If you were writing about molecular biology, you probably have a pretty small academic audience, and there might be a few things that you could write for a general audience, but all the stuff about the protein chains and bonding sites and enzymes, that's for an expert audience. But the problem is everybody's interested in economics. So everybody's going to want to read it, and it's got to satisfy everybody. And that's particularly true if you're writing about things that have to do with policy, because policy affects people, and people get really exercised about it. People care about policy. So you better make sure that you dot all your I's and cross all your T's, because people will be looking for holes in anything that you write. So that's a good place for me to stop, I think. I hope I sort of built you up and you're thinking about economics to the point where you could start to think about how to write about it as well. So if Eileen has some questions, why don't you fire away?
Yeah, so the first question I've got, let's see. They asked, what is the best way to kickstart a journalist career, especially in economic journalism?
Start writing. Start writing. I don't know if you've heard of this guy, but there's a guy, I haven't really followed economics Twitter for a while, but there's a guy named Evan Soltas, S-O-L-T-A-S, Evan Soltas, who started blogging and tweeting and writing about economics when he was in high school. And then he went to Princeton, I think, for college, I'm not sure. But he was already writing at a pretty high level in high school because he was just really trying to read up as much as he could and learn as much as he could. And one way for him to test his own understanding was to write about it and see what people said. To become part of that online community. And online communities can sometimes be nice places, sometimes nasty, but he dove right in. And so he was immediately getting a lot of feedback, and being a young guy, he was getting smarter and smarter at a pretty rapid pace. So, I think the best way to learn how to do it is just start doing it. And of course, when you go to college, you'll have opportunities to do it in your college newspapers, things like that. That's a good opportunity to take as well. That's where I really started to write more seriously about policy issues as I was learning economics along the way. There's just a huge amount of information out there, and just read whatever you can get your hands on. There's another well-known commentator named Matt Iglesias, and he never studied economics in college. I think it was some sort of liberal arts major. I don't remember what. I think he went to Yale, but he just loved economics, so he read as much as he could again, and he's basically self-taught. And that means that occasionally he might make a little mistake where someone with the kind of training that I have might say, well, that's not quite right. But he does have a huge amount of knowledge, and he's a good writer. So, You know, the best way to get better at it and to get better at writing in general is just to write. I'll give you 2 quick tips for writing, by the way. Sometimes you want to write something and you just don't know where to start. So start wherever it feels easiest. You know, start in the middle. You know, just write down all the points that you want to make somewhere in your piece. Then you can start ordering them a little bit, start kind of putting them into an outline. And then there might be some areas that you're not really sure of. I'm not sure how to start the piece. I'm not sure how to end the piece. Well, start in the middle. Start somewhere else. Just start writing. And if you can't start writing, here's the second tip. Lower your standards. Okay? Just write anything. Type chicken scratch, whatever it is. And then you can edit that. But just write.
Thank you so much for those tips. They're really helpful. I've gotten a couple more questions. The first is, which sectors of the economy will recover the fastest and the slowest from the pandemic?
Well, there were some parts of the economy that benefited from the pandemic. I mean, look at Amazon. Amazon's been doing great business through the pandemic because you can get stuff delivered in a box and you don't have to go into a store. You know, Jeff Bezos recently had his net worth cross $200 billion, the first person in history to do that. So, you know, there's some areas that have been benefiting. All the people making the personal protective equipment, the masks and the gloves and all that stuff, they've never seen business like that. Even people who produce plexiglass, because all the shops want plexiglass screens now and stuff like that. You know, just there are almost always winners, even when there are losers. And then when it comes to who's going to recover, well, as we see reopening happening, a lot of the things that we think of as almost essential, like personal hygiene products and people getting haircuts, stuff like that, that's starting to rebound. And there's been a big appetite for some of the entertainment stuff as well. Now, when we enter an economic downturn, there are some things that are viewed as kind of luxuries that people don't do as much. So you know, they might not be buying new stereos or something like that. Fine. I don't know who even has stereos these days, but they might not be buying some of those more luxury type items. That's not necessarily true at the very high ends, because wealthy people may not have felt much of a dent from this. They actually, stock market's been going up. So very wealthy people might not have felt too different about their consumption. So if you're looking at purchases of extremely fancy cars, it's not clear that that would have taken a huge hit. But there are also some things in the middle, because there are some products that people buy as substitutes for the luxury products that they can't have. So you might say, well, I can't go to the spa and get a makeover, but instead I could buy a lipstick and that'll make me happy today. And the lipstick only costs $4, whereas going for a makeover would cost $150. So there's some products that people buy as substitutes for things that they can no longer buy when their budget constraints shrink a little bit. So you got to keep an eye out for all those
things. The next question is, do you have any thoughts on the Captain Samuel Vimes Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness?
Can you tell me the name again?
The Captain Samuel Vimes Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness.
I think that rings a bell, but I don't know it. So you have to tell me what it is before I can tell you if I have any thoughts about it.
If whoever sent that wants to send a clarification or turn your mic off, feel free. But if not, we'll just hop to the next one. So someone asks, do you think that the EU is vulnerable against the big account deficits of the southern countries to big banks, which leads to their decreased GDP and wages? The northern countries are also more frugal and not always willing to help.
Yeah, so in my last book, I wrote that I thought that the EU was probably going to splinter, and it almost splinters under geographical lines when you look at the different economic futures that lie ahead for some of these countries. And yeah, I think the EU, after the last banking crisis following the Great Recession, did make some improvements in governance, but they still don't have banking regulations at the same level you would want to go across the entire community. You know, you would want banking union, not just some common regulations. So I think they're still vulnerable to these kinds of problems. And, you know, for southern countries' banks to be requiring handouts from northern countries is always something that's going to create political tension. I think it can happen again. You know, last time you had the director of central bank, Mario Monti, basically saying he would do whatever it took to back up the euro. That kind of line in the sand actually worked and reduced some of the instability and started to turn things around in financial terms. You would have to have someone who would do the same thing if they were to encounter that sort of crisis again. And he happened to be the right person with the right policy in the right place at the right time. If you don't get that the next time, things could be messier.
I actually got a clarification on the theory where it states that rich people were rich because they managed to spend less money because they can afford better quality products. So an example would be like a worker's boots last one. Yeah.
Right. I think this is one engine of inequality, but not the only one. Okay. I agree. Yeah. If you have to buy crappy product again and again and again because you never have enough liquidity to buy a nice product that lasts, then you're right. That would probably cause inequality. However, if you look at the actual consumption patterns of rich people, they don't buy just one pair of nice shoes. They buy 20 pairs of nice shoes. So they're also buying 20 pairs of shoes. They're just buying fancier ones. And they might buy more pairs of shoes than someone who is forced to buy the crappy shoes. Now, yeah, the person with the crappy shoes that they have to buy again and again, yeah, it's costing them money in a way that's inefficient, right? Because they'd like to buy a pair of shoes that lasted longer. And so I think it is an engine of inequality, but not by any means the biggest one. If I had to name other engines of inequality, I would say that you know, changes in worker bargaining power are probably one of the most important. Okay, we've had lots of things that have decreased the bargaining power of workers from year to year. One has been deunionization in the US. Now only 10 or 15% of workers are represented by unions. And on the other side of the table, there's been a lot of corporate consolidation. So, you know, on the workers' side, everything's splintered. They don't have as much collective bargaining. And on the corporate side, they've had fewer potential employers per worker now. I think I wrote a piece a while back in Foreign Policy called The Bad Bargain, and I cited some statistics about how many companies there were per worker. So now there are fewer potential employers, so that means that each employer has more bargaining power against the workers. So bargaining power is where it's at, right? Because you know how much a worker's productivity is worth, but how much they're actually going to get paid comes down to their bargaining power. So that's one engine. Another engine is technological change, right? You're not just bargaining against your employer, you're bargaining against the robots that they could hire. Globalization, you're bargaining against workers from around the world, right? We're all competing for the same job. And so all these factors together, I think I cited 4 of them now, are reducing worker bargaining power. And that means that they're going to get paid as close to their sort of reservation wage, the wage that they would not work below, as possible. And all of the surplus from their productivity is just going to go to their employers, who are the owners of capital, right? So, that's why in this country we've seen the share of income that belongs to the owners of labor, the workers, go down and down, and the share of income that goes to the owners of capital go up and up, because the workers have less bargaining power. That's a huge engine of inequality. And a second one is one that we're witnessing right now. What happens during an economic cycle? When the economic downturn happens, poor people feel the crunch more than rich people, right? Because they're already living hand to mouth. So if they lose their jobs, that's a huge crisis for them. Well, what happens at that point? They might have to sell their house, or their house might be foreclosed on. They might have to sell other assets. Well, who comes in to buy those things? Rich people do, and they buy them on the cheap. So it's like an engine of inequality, because every time there's an economic downturn, rich people essentially get richer on the backs of the poor people, because they're able to buy up all their assets on the cheap. And poor people have to have a fire sale. So, I witnessed this happen when I was living in Argentina. We went through one of these cycles, and now it's happening here as well. Fortunately, there are some government protections now against foreclosures, stuff like that, but I think it's still a problem. So yeah, I understand the boots thing. It makes sense, but I don't think it's the most important mechanism.
The next question I have is more on the side of writing. They ask, what are some tips on connecting like a piece that you're writing to a broader issue or theme?
It probably should go the other way around, which is, what's the broader issue or theme or the thing that's in the news that is really interesting, that makes you want to write something, and then look for the economics behind it, right? If you start the other way around, just say, I want to write a piece about trade, yeah, you could probably find stuff that's going on in the world that is related to trade, and that could be what we call the peg for your piece, the thing that makes it newsworthy or more topical. But most of the time when we write, we're reacting to things that are actually happening to help people understand why they're happening. If interest rates are going down, why? And then you say, okay, well, interest rates going down is the interesting thing that's going on that people are curious about. Let's help them to understand why by going into the economics.
The next question I have is, has there been any issue where the authorities, such as government, was triggered because of an economic writing piece? And how does the writer's career and confidence, how is it affected by this?
So what was triggered? Can you say that again?
Where the government is triggered from a piece.
Where they made a policy change or something like that? Okay. Listen, I think that's what a lot of people want when they're writing about economic policy. They want people who are in a position to make decisions to listen to them and to try and influence those decisions. So if you're successful in influencing those decisions, then that's a good thing for you. And it's not just for journalists. I remember when I was first teaching economics as a grad student, David Elwood had just come back from a couple of years in Washington, and he said it was a very interesting time. He's an economist, and he was working on policy in the Clinton administration. It was a very interesting time for him because he went to Washington to accomplish 3 things, and he accomplished 2 of them in the first couple of weeks. And I don't know if he ever accomplished the 3rd. So, most of his 2 years was spent in frustration, but he actually achieved 2/3 of the things he wanted to do. So he was pretty satisfied about that. The big thing that he was excited about was the earned income tax credit, that he had essentially pushed the president to work with Congress to create the earned income tax credit, which lowers the marginal tax rates for people at lower incomes, so that gives them an incentive to work even as they're getting tax assistance. And that was one of the things that he was able to do. So I think he got a lot of satisfaction out of that, ultimately. And I think that's what a lot of economists dream about, is the ability to influence policy in that way. Sometimes a little recognition can make you feel funny. When I was writing for foreign policy, I used to put out something called the Baseline Profitability Index, which was an index of the attractiveness of making direct foreign investments in different countries, so buying equity in companies in different countries. And one year, India came up at the top for the potential returns going into the future. And so we came up with this piece every year, and it got a lot of attention. Well, this time, when we tweeted it out and we promoted it on social media, the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, actually tweeted about it. India #1, he was excited, and he got 40,000 likes or something like that. So yeah, it's nice when somebody notices what you've been working on, but I have mixed feelings about Prime Minister Modi, so I don't know how that really made me feel. People want to be part of the debate. That's a big reason why people get into economics, and if they can influence policy in a way that makes people better off, I think that can create a lot of satisfaction.
I think another part of the question that we want to clarify about was, what if the government responds aggressively, so speaks out against an article that someone wrote or against the writer in some way?
That's fine. I mean, as long as you're in a free country where you're not going to be persecuted, that's fine, because you want to have that debate. You want them to show their true colors. If you think you're right and they disagree with you, let them say it so everybody can see that they disagree with you. Then if people sympathize with your point of view, then they might want to change the government. But if that happens to you in a country where you can be persecuted, that's obviously a danger to you, and you have to make those decisions very carefully.
This is another question about writing. What are some common mistakes when writing about economics that you see?
Common mistakes when writing about economics. Well, one is to get too technical, all right? Use a lot of jargon. You know, I've thrown a couple of bits of jargon in, but I've been careful to explain them, like foreign direct investment, for example. That means buying an equity stake, which means buying shares in a company overseas. You could just say buying shares in a company overseas. You don't even have to use the jargon, right? So stay away from jargon. Even if you're writing for economists, stay away from jargon. Economists can still understand regular language too. And another thing I would say is, don't think that because you've got really cool economic ideas, you don't have to be a good writer. You know, you still have to, and it's similar to the jargon thing, but you still have to write a well-structured essay. You can't be lazy about that part just because you come up with this formula that's so cool. And the last thing I would say is, some people, I think they write stuff and they didn't make sure that they really understood it at a deep level. There was no sort of reality check or smell test. If you come to a conclusion and it seems really counterintuitive or strange, but that makes it interesting, you better look at it twice and 3 times just to make sure that you didn't make a mistake somewhere. It happened to me one time in quite an embarrassing situation. I was in the middle of an editorial meeting at the Economist in London, and I argued something about trade completely backwards. And somebody pointed out to me, and I was like, oh crap, you're right. I think it was exchange rates or something. So it can happen to anybody, but just be careful, especially if something seems a little counterintuitive. Maybe you've actually got it backwards.
Great, thank you. The next question is, do you think Trump's tariffs to China are effective to bring jobs back in the Midwest? Also, China has copied and improved on sensitive technology and developed some better algorithms, so are we right to worry?
2 different questions, and the second one is not so much an economics question, it's more of a technical question, so I don't know if I can really answer it. But, you know, economists, as a rule, don't like tariffs because they're in favor of free trade. They think free trade can make everybody better off. But as I said earlier, the promise of free trade to make everybody better off is usually unfulfilled. Usually we don't redistribute those gains to the winners. So while the idea of tariffs is usually repugnant to economists, I think we have to think twice. Here's the thing. If we put tariffs on Chinese products, which are typically lower priced products, yeah, we could bring some jobs back to the US, but they're going to be lower wage jobs. They're not the kind of jobs that are going to help us to have higher living standards in the future. It's better than no job, right? But it's not as good as the kind of jobs that are created by starting new industries and getting more productive, things like that. So we're in the world of the second best, as economists like to say. You know, the first best world, the first best solution would be we have totally free trade and we redistribute and everybody gets better and better off. But we're not doing that. Policy is not doing that. So we are in the world of the second best. And in the world of the second best, as one of my professors used to say, anything can happen. Tariffs could be good in the world of the second best. If the only way to make sure that people in the United States eat is to make sure they have low-wage jobs that would otherwise be done in China or other less developed countries, maybe that's what we have to do. I still have to think that in the long term, these tariffs are not a great idea. But what I would rather see is the United States making investments in infrastructure and education and science and technology, all those things that can help us to create those good jobs in those new industries, rather than just buying more guns and stuff like that, you know? So as I said, I can imagine a second best that's better than this one, but I can't rule it out of hand.
Thank you. So one of the next questions is, what has been your favorite job after graduate school?
My favorite job after graduate school? That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that very much. You know, I've enjoyed parts of all the jobs that I did. I think that being a journalist was exciting. You know, living in different places, the opportunities that I had to do that was certainly very exciting. The Economist was probably the best workplace I've been in. It was really collegial. People used to hang out after work, and you know, you made some really good friends there, and you really learned a lot there. It was a stimulating place, not a very diverse place, I have to say, nor is it now, 20 years later, which is kind of disturbing. But it was a very collegial place, and I enjoyed that. And you know, I've been lucky to have some jobs that would give me experiences that I wouldn't have had any other way. You know, I set up my consulting company to work in soccer because I love soccer, and I felt like doing something different after 15 years as a kind of standard economist. And yeah, I found myself eating lunch at the same table with Raheem Sterling and Joe Hart one day, or big name soccer stars at Manchester City. And yeah, that never would have happened any other way. So I would say to you, and maybe this is not something that your parents or professors would love me to say, but think about your life as a series of experiences as well as achievements. Okay, so you know, I may not have achievements at the very pinnacle of the fields that I was in. I never won a Pulitzer Prize or a Nobel Prize or anything like that, but I've had some great experiences. So I look back on that with a lot of satisfaction.
The next question is, what are some fallacies or inefficiencies of a libertarian economic system?
Well, a libertarian system in its extreme would, for example, have no taxes. And if you have no taxes, then you can't have any public goods, right? You can't buy any things that are useful to everybody. So that means no government money for basic research. That means no national defense. That means no Medicare system, anything like that. That seems suboptimal to me. We know that public goods can make people better off when they get together to purchase them than they would otherwise be, right? You know, the typical example in economics classes is national defense, right? We want to protect our country from adversaries, and the best way to do that is to get together and pay for it, because if we all had to personally buy a tank to put on our lawn, we would have to spend much more money, and most of us wouldn't be able to afford it. So it just seems obvious that you have to have public goods, and in a totally libertarian system, you wouldn't even have that. So I think that's a good place to start in that discussion.
Another question I have here is, what are your thoughts on ESOP?
ESOP, are these the work study opportunities? Or is this something ESOP?
Employee stock ownership programs.
Oh yeah, sure. So this was something where I might have fallen afoul of some of the people in policy circles around the time of the last election, because Hillary Clinton was really advocating for this as a way to correct that bargaining power problem that I outlined before. As I said, more and more of national income was going to owners of capital than to owners of labor, going to people who own shares in companies rather than people who worked. And Hillary Clinton said, well, let's change that by turning the workers into owners, by having them own more and more shares in the companies where they work. And for me, it was not the best idea. You know, yes, you want people to share in the income that they generate, but when you have a large portion of your financial portfolio invested in the company where you work, you are really undiversified. You are in a very risky position, because if that company goes bust, you lost your portfolio and your job. And usually when you lose your job, it's your savings that you rely on to get you through to the next job. But you lost your savings too. Okay? And this happened to a lot of people in that Enron situation that I mentioned from back in 2002. Enron had really generous employee stock plans, and people loved the company so much when they were working there that they bought stock voluntarily in the company. And so they put themselves in an extremely risky position. So when the company went bust, they actually lost everything. They lost their jobs and a lot of their savings as well. So for me, you know, this just, it sounds like a good idea in theory, but if you are, you know, keeping all of your assets in your portfolio associated with the same company where you work, you are taking a lot of risks. And, you know, I encourage people, if they have a stock ownership plan as part of their job, you know, maybe you go work for a tech company and you get shares, you know, as soon as those shares get vested, that means as soon as you now become the full owner of those shares, sell them and diversify. I mean, you may have to keep some of them and you may have a lot of faith in that company, but you need to be diversified as well, so that if something bad happens, you have something to fall back on.
I think this can be one of our last questions, but if you have all the knowledge that you have today, what would you do differently in high school?
I probably would have taken time off between college and graduate school. That's one thing. I would have gone and worked, because I think that it would have helped me to learn that feel for economics that I was talking about before. And I also think that the people who went to economics grad school after having worked in the real world for a while really knew why they were there. You know, they had experienced a bit of the world, and they still decided that they wanted to go back and get a PhD. And that was a much more informed decision than my decision. My decision was just kind of, economics is going well, I'm doing research, both my parents had PhDs, and so it's just like, get a PhD. And so I did that. But halfway through, I started to have a lot of questions about whether I really wanted to do it. And the sort of academic track that most PhD programs guide you to turned out not to be for me. So I don't know if I had not gone straight to grad school, I don't know if I ever would have gone in the end. But I'm grateful that I did still, because like I said, economics teaches you this way of looking at the world, and a PhD in economics is a great credential, which essentially means you never have to be poor, because there will always be people who hire economists. But yeah, you know, I would have taken a bit more time off, just to get a bit more experience and context and wisdom about the world. And besides that, you know, when you're in college, I think it's important to try a bunch of different things. I actually went into college thinking I was going to be a chemistry major. And I took physics in my first semester. I placed into an organic class for the second semester. And I went to the first lecture of the organic class, and I wasn't that enthusiastic. I was more enthusiastic about my first year economics class, which I was just taking as an elective to fill a requirement. So, you know, I think you just need to try different things, because you don't know what's going to resonate.
Well, I haven't been getting any more questions, so if anyone has any last questions, feel free to email me, or I guess put it in chat. But thank you so much, Mr. Altman, for coming to speak with us today. Everything that you've said, all the questions and your answers have been really interesting and eye-opening, especially for all of our junior economist writers here, who I know were excited and really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm glad that we got to spend this time together. I wish you all the best of luck. And, you know, if you get down the road and you need a little bit of advice on some of these issues, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll do the best I can to help you, because I've been very lucky in my career. And so any way I can share some of that with you guys, I'm happy to do it.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the JEC NYC members and all of the JEC members from other branches who have come today. We really hope to see you in future events. And yeah, thank you.
All right, take care of yourself. Bye.